This is lecture 57E in the series The ABCs of Communism, Bolshevism 2018, and our subject is the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, 1945 to 1954, and our first topic, of course, is the Revolutionary War. In 1936, in France itself, there was an anti-fascist Popular Front government, including deputies from parties of the center and the communists. This Popular Front government started a new policy for the French colonies, including Indochina. Unfortunately, the Cap half of the front was insincere, to say the least. Although the unpopular Vietnam Governor General was replaced, this was duplicitous. It was meant to encourage non-communist Vietnamese to meet a French commission of inquiry and thus split them away from the ICP and the Viet Minh. Stalin's Cheka spies in France discovered the real policy and proved it by getting a copy of the secret order to the Vietnam colonial government from the French minister for the colonies, whose name was Marius Moutet, in September 1936. And it said, "You will maintain public order no matter what we say here in Paris. Your political and economic situation is our preoccupation. Whatever means are necessary, French order must reign in Indochina." Unquote. Meanwhile, in 1937, throughout East and Southeast Asia, tensions had been building between the United States and Japan as Japan expanded into China. Franklin D. Roosevelt regarded this as an infringement on U.S. interests in China. The Japanese had slapped FDR in the face by bombing the USS Panay gunboat on the Yangtze River in China. In August 1938, the phony Popular Front government in Paris fell. The new French government had anti-communist security in metropolitan France and the Empire as its primary concern. For Indochina, it named General Georges Catroux Governor General. In 1939, Paris outlawed the French and Indochinese Communist parties. In 1940, the big bourgeoisie in France sold out their country to the Hitlerites. As the Nazi armies advanced, the French armies were ordered to offer no resistance and to retreat. Meanwhile, England's former King Edward VIII, now David Duke of Windsor, who was on the Anglo-French military command in Paris, had given Hitler's agents the details of how to break through the Maginot Line, and then he fled to fascist Spain. On June 22, 1940, the traitor regime in Paris signed an armistice with Hitler, giving two-thirds of France to the Nazis. The remaining part in southeast France and the French colonies was placed under a Nazi puppet regime headed by Marshal Philippe Pétain. This so-called republic had its capital at Vichy. On the 22nd of September 1940, the Vichy government agreed to allow Japan to station soldiers in Tonkin. During World War II, Japan would station a large number of soldiers and sailors in Vietnam, and they co-opted the French administrative structure. On the 23rd of December 1940, the French sold out Vietnam to Japan. In Vietnam, they encouraged Vietnamese people en masse to join the Viet Minh revolt against French rule, first in Bac Son near the Chinese border, and then in Cochin, China. The Gringo consul in Saigon reported that the French occupation regime had killed thousands of natives and more are in prison awaiting execution. He described promiscuous machine gunning of Vietnamese civilians by French soldiers. From 1940 to 1946, Indochina was in a war of the ICP against the Vichy puppet regime and Japan. Vichy Indochina was divided into 5 protectorates: Cambodia, Laos, Tonkin, Annam, and Cochin, China. These were North, South, Central, and South Vietnam. In 1940, the French controlled 23 million Vietnamese with 12,000 French soldiers and 40,000 Vietnamese puppet soldiers and their secret police force, the Sûreté. The ICP led its Viet Minh insurgents against French and Japanese military installations and banks. The Viet Minh was most successful in northern Vietnam, Tonkin. The ICP led a broad front of insurgent groups in central Vietnam, Annam, and southern Vietnam, Cochin, China. During World War II, Japan stationed a big contingent of Army and Navy operations in Vietnam. The Viet Minh also constantly attacked these. Late in World War II, the U.S. gave limited assistance to the Vietnamese as they did with the communists in China, because they were the only ones in Vietnam or China actually fighting Nippon. After World War II, France attempted to regain its colonial domination of Indochina, that is, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. Consequently, the ICP and the Viet Minh went over to attacking the new French occupation troops as they arrived. The USA, under the fascist Meyer-Lansky's flunky Harry Truman, reversed FDR's foreign policy and helped the French reinvade. The Democratic Republic of Vietnam in Hanoi on 2 December 1945, Ho read Vietnam's Declaration of Independence proclaiming the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. The third phase of the 1925 Communist Plan had been completed. On 24 September 1945 in Saigon, the British commander, General Sir Douglas Gracey, declared martial law. The Viet Minh leaders responded with a call for a general strike. Reinvasion in the guise of Potsdam. In September 1945, a force of 200,000 Chiang Kai-shek Army troops arrived in Hanoi. The Potsdam Conference had assigned the acceptance of the surrender of the Japanese occupiers in northern Indochina to his regime. Ho made a compromise with Chiang General Liu Han to dissolve the Communist Party and to hold an election that would yield a coalition government. When Chiang forced the French to give their concessions in Shanghai back to China in exchange for withdrawing from northern Indochina, Ho had no choice but to sign an agreement with France on 6 March 1946. That agreement had Vietnam recognized as an autonomous state in the Indochinese Federation and the French Union. But that agreement soon broke down. The purpose of the agreement for both the French and Viet Minh was for Chiang's army to leave North Vietnam. Fighting broke out in the north soon after the Chinese left, between the French and the Viet Minh. Now, the shot heard around the world. The French government was owned by a tiny oligarchy of billionaires who had made great fortunes from their cash cow colony in Vietnam. They were quite willing to fight to the last drop of French working-class blood to hold on to it. French workers would have a different interest, of course, and this would soon become apparent as resistance to the war grew by leaps and bounds back home. In the meantime, a bloodbath would ensue. All-out war was just a shot away. On 23 November 1946, the French fleet began a naval bombardment of Hanoi's Haiphong harbor. That killed over 6,000 Vietnamese civilians in one afternoon. The DRV government quickly agreed to a ceasefire and abandoned the cities. France did not intend to allow an autonomous, independent state in Vietnam, nor would the communist government allow a slaughter of the Vietnamese people caught between the contending patriotic forces and the imperialist invaders. On 19 December 46, Ho's government, now ensconced in the mountains to the north of Hanoi, declared war against France. Vietnam's new national army, armed with little more than machetes and muskets, had immediately counterattacked French positions. Despite a lack of modern small arms, they were able to smoke out the foreign soldiers with straw bundled with chili pepper, and they destroyed armored vehicles with improvised lunge mines. These were hollow charge warheads on the ends of poles that detonated when thrust against the side of a tank. Tried and true Molotov cocktails did yeoman damage to frog units. Fighting had raged for 2 months before Vo Nguyen Giap decided to withdraw his fighting units from the front lines, joining the government in the mountains bordering China. For the next 3 years, the communist forces were trained by Chinese Red Army officers and men in the various arts of modern warfare. 1947 to 1954, taking France to Dien Bien Phu. The Vietnamese intended to fight until they won, no matter what the cost. General Vo Nguyen Giap trained 30,000 men to attack the imperialists in Hanoi alone. The way was about to be cleared for the final years of war between the communist-led forces of Socialist Vietnam and their National Liberation Front and French imperialism. In 1947, General Vo Nguyen Giap built his high command headquarters in Tan Trao, deep in the hills of Tuyen Quang province. The French tried to attack his mountain bases, But Giap had learned from the Chinese that it was the better strategy to refuse to meet them head-on in battle until you knew you would win. Wherever the French troops went, the Viet Minh disappeared. Late in 1947, the French launched Operation Leah to take out the Viet Minh Communication Center at Bac Can. That failed. In the course of these constant failures, the French military was spending a lot of money and getting nowhere. Opposition back home in France was growing. In 1948, France started looking for means of opposing the Viet Minh politically with an alternative government in Saigon. They suborned the former Emperor Bao Day, and he agreed to form an autonomous government within the French Union of Nations called the Republic of Vietnam. Bao Day had enthusiastically gone onto the French payroll in the past, and he was glad to make more millions doing it again. In 1949, France officially recognized the independence of Bao Day's Vietnam within the French Union. France still controlled all foreign relations and every defense issue in Vietnam, and the Viet Minh said they would settle for nothing less than real independence. The French raised a conscript army of Vietnamese to offset their own losses. However, these troops were so unreliable they could only be used to garrison quiet sectors of the country. French soldiers continued to take it in the ass in real combat. Private gangster armies were often used to pacify workers in the cities and rebellious farmers on the land. The Truman Gang stepped up weapons and observers to the French in Indochina. The Chinese continued their assistance to the Vietnamese. General Giap reorganized his local irregular forces into 5 full conventional infantry divisions, the 304th, 308th, 312th, 316th, and 320th. Giap then went on the offensive, attacking isolated French bases along the Chinese border. In February 1950, General Giap overran the strong French garrison at Lattre in Tonkin, just south of the border with China. On the 15th of September 1950, Major General Tay attacked Dong Quai, and on the 18th of September, 3 days later, Dong Quai was overrun. On October 3, 1950, Cao Bang was liberated, and the DRV Army went on to subdue the 4,000-strong French Foreign Legion garrison at Lang Son. The French were on the run, retreating on Highway No. 4. They were joined in their panic by the relief force that had been coming to their rescue from Tat Khe. The two forces ended up fleeing together and were attacked all the way by ambushing communist units. The French airdropped a paratroop battalion south of Cao Bang to act as diversion, only to see it quickly surrounded and destroyed. On the 17th of October 1950, the surviving French cut their losses and fled Lang Son. By the time the remains of these garrisons reached the safety of the Red River Delta, 4,800 French troops had were dead and 2,000 wounded. Also gone were 13 artillery pieces, 125 mortars, 450 trucks, 940 machine guns, 1,200 submachine guns, and 8,000 rifles destroyed or captured during the fighting. China and the Soviet Union recognized Ho Chi Minh as legitimate ruler of Vietnam, sending the DRV more and more supplies and material aid. The year 1950 marked the first time napalm had been used in Vietnam. It was supplied by the USA for use by the French Air Force. A new French commander, General Jean-Marie de Lattre de Tassigny, built a fortified line from Hanoi to the Gulf of Tonkin across the Red River Delta that became known as the Lattre Line. On the 13th of January 1951, General Giap moved the 10,000 men each 308th and 312th Divisions into position to attack Vinh Yên, 20 miles northwest of Hanoi. There the invaders had lost their 6,000-man 9th Foreign Legion Brigade. Giap had walked into a trap and was cut down by concentrated French artillery and machine gun fire, however. On the 16th of January 1951, the Battle of Vinh Yên ended with Giap forced to withdraw, and the DRV lost 6,000 troops killed and 8,000 wounded. On March 23, 1951, Giap launched an assault on Mao Khe, 20 miles north of Haiphong. The 316th Division of 11,000 men, with the rebuilt 308th and 312th Divisions in reserve, made the assault, and again the DRV lost. On 28 March 1951, Giap withdrew. On 29 May 1951, Giap launched an attack against French positions on the Day River. The 304th Division hit Phu Lai, the 308th Division hit Dien Bien, while the DRV main force, spearheaded by the 320th Division, attacked Phat Diem south of Hanoi. By the 18th of June 1951, the mutual bloodletting and the Lattre counteroffensive brought the war to a stalemate. Every effort by Boney and Giap to break the Lattre Line had failed, and every attack he made was answered by a French counterattack. Back home in France, the situation seemed hopeless, and there was increasing opposition to the war. On 31 July 1951, French General Charles Chanson was assassinated at Sa Dec in South Vietnam, and on the 14th of November that year, 1951, French paratroopers seized Hoa Binh, 25 miles west of the Lattre Line. In January 1952, General Lattre was recalled to France, and he died shortly thereafter and was replaced by General Raoul Salan as commander of all French forces in Indochina. On 20 February 1952, Giap launched attacks on Hoa Binh, forcing the French to withdraw back to their main positions on the Lattre Line by the 22nd of February 1952, 2 days later. Each side lost roughly 5,000 men in this campaign, proving the war to be a lost cause for France. In 1952, throughout the war theater, the DRV armed forces cut French supply lines, wearing down the French forces. There were continued raids, skirmishes, and guerrilla attacks, while each side withdrew to prepare the way for a final solution. And it was the frogs who moved first. On December 1952, the Battle of Nha San saw the French use hedgehog tactics. By this, they meant building strong points that would require General Giap to fight conventional battles instead of using guerrilla tactics, but the strategy did not work. On the 17th of October 1952, Giap launched attacks against the French garrisons along Ningxia Lo, northwest of Hanoi, and in the process he overran the Black River Valley, isolating the imperialist airfield at Nha San. The French had made Nha San an entrenched strongpoint. Giap by now had control over most of Tonkin beyond the Lattre Line. Imperialist Generalissimo Raoul Salan knew the entire French military situation was critical. With little to lose, he launched Operation Lorraine along the Clear River, hoping to force Giap to relieve pressure on the Ningxia Lo outpost northwest of Hanoi. On 29 October 1952, in the largest operation in Indochina today, 30,000 French Union soldiers moved out from the Lattre Line to attack the DRV supply dumps at Phu Yen. Salan took Phu Tho on November 5th and Phu Doan on November 9th by a parachute drop, and finally Phu Yen on November 13th. Then he stopped, because any further advances would inevitably lead him into traps, because communist forces controlled the entire countryside. Salan began to withdraw his troops back to the Lattre Line, but they were ambushed at Chan Muong on 17 November 1952, and the French lost around 1,200 men dead during the operation, most of them during the Chan Muong ambush, and the operation failed to divert the overall Giap offensive, or even to damage his logistical network. Springing the strategic trap, the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. On 9 April 1953, Giap began invading Laos. By surrounding and defeating several French outposts such as Buang Qua, he was drawing the French forces much farther away from their main base in Hanoi and Haiphong Harbor. In May 1953, General Henry Navarre replaced Salan as Supreme Commander of French forces in Indochina. After an in-country first-hand review, he told the truth to Paris, quote, "There is no possibility of winning the war in Indochina," unquote, saying that the best the French could hope for was a stalemate. Navarre's response to Giap's offensive was what Giap expected, more hedgehog centers of defense. First, Navarre chose to send General de Castries to fortify the small town of Dien Bien Phu 10 miles north of the Lao border and 170 miles west of Hanoi. The idea was to block the Viet Minh from sending more troops to Laos. Dien Bien Phu was on the main DRV supply route into Laos along the Nam Yum River. It had already had an airstrip, and it was situated in the Tay Hills where Navarre believed many Tay tribesmen were still loyal to the French. He was wrong on every count. On the 20th of November 1953, Operation Castor was launched. 1,800 paratroopers of the French 1st and 2nd Airborne Battalions dropped into the valley of Dien Bien Phu, apparently sweeping aside the local DRV garrison that had actually melted on command into the mountains. The paratroopers took control of the 12-mile-long, 8-mile-wide valley surrounded by heavily wooded hills. Encountering surprisingly little opposition, the French established ongoing patrols in the hills. The Castries began by building a master hedgehog with strong points each named for one of his girlfriends. From 20 November to 15 December 1953, General Giap secretly moved his forces from the Lattre Line to Dien Bien Phu. As they arrived, they joined the in-situ DRV units that had made the earlier retrograde from the valley, and together they annihilated the French and Tay patrols in the hills around the town. It took 57 days for the Communist armies to isolate the French Hedgehog at Dien Bien Phu. By 1954, the war in Indochina was increasingly unpopular with the French public. The U.S. Pentagon was divided, with some generals wanting to intervene and others seeing it as a lost cause. On the 13th of March 1954, the decisive battle of the war began at Dien Bien Phu with a DRV attack on the French Hedgehog. The French imperialists, supported by the U.S. imperialists, were now against the DRV main forces that occupied the mountains surrounding their Hedgehog. China and the Soviet Union supported Vo Nguyen Giap. The French Hedgehog was near the village of Dien Bien Phu. Now the Communist forces had it surrounded on all sides by trenches. They kept digging closer and closer to the French barbed wire and concrete fortifications at the master Hedgehog. The DRV opening attack surprised the French with heavy artillery. The Frog High Command had no idea that the Reds had such big guns. DRV artillery damaged both the main and secondary airfields that the French were using to fly in supplies. Then the only road into Dien Bien Phu, already nearly impassable, was completely severed. With French supply lines interrupted, their position was untenable. The monsoon season made dropping supplies and reinforcements by parachutes difficult. Now, they tried to weasel their way out. With defeat imminent, the French sought to hold on by opening a Geneva peace meeting on April 26, 1954. The last French offensive took place on the 4th of May, 1954, but it was pathetically ineffective. The DRV army then began to hammer the outpost with newly supplied Soviet Katyusha rockets. Too late, May 7, 1954. The final fall took the 2 days of 6 to 7 May 1954, during which the French were overrun by a huge frontal assault. General Cogly, based in Hanoi, ordered General de Castries, who was commanding the outpost, to cease fire at 5:30 p.m. on May 7, 1954, and to destroy all materiel, weapons, transmissions, etc., to deny their use to the enemy. The fighting ended on May 7, 1954, except at Isabelle, the isolated southernmost position, where the battle lasted until 8 May 1954, when French guns went silent at 1 a.m. At least 4,000 members of the 20,000-strong French forces had died or were MIA. 11,721 more were taken POW. Of the 50,000 DRV soldiers involved, 7,000 were killed and 12,000 wounded. 1 month after Dien Bien Phu, the composite group mobile of the French forces fled their An-Khe outpost. However, their evacuation was only to be ambushed by a larger DRV force at the Battle of Mangyang Pass. That battle lasted from June 24th to July 17th, 1954. The DRV victory at Dien Bien Phu decided the outcome of the 21 July 1954 Geneva meeting of interested nations. So the evacuation of Catholic Vietnamese civilians from Communist North Vietnam ended the war. In France, Pierre Mendès France, opponent of the war since 1950, had been made Prime Minister on June 17, 1954, on his promise to put an end to the war, reaching a ceasefire in 4 months. And he did. The Geneva Conference on July 21, 1954, recognized the 17th parallel north as a provisional military demarcation line, temporarily dividing the country into 2 zones, Communist North Vietnam and pro-U.S. South Vietnam. The Geneva Accord promised elections in 1956 to determine a national government for a united Vietnam. Neither the U.S. government nor Ngo Dien Diem's Southern Republic of Vietnam signed anything at the 1954 Geneva Conference. The French accepted the proposal of the DRV delegate Pham Van Dong, who had proposed that Vietnam eventually be united by elections under the supervision of local commissions. The U.S. countered with what became known as the American Plan, with the support of their puppet regime in South Vietnam and the United Kingdom. It provided for unification elections that would be held under the supervision of the United Nations, but that was rejected by the Soviet delegation. From his home in France, Emperor Bao Dai appointed Ngo Diem as Prime Minister of South Vietnam. At U.S. direction in 1955, Diem used a phony referendum to remove the former emperor and declared himself the President of the Republic of Vietnam. When the reunification elections failed to occur, Communist Party of Vietnam cadres who stayed behind in South Vietnam were activated, and they started to fight the puppet government. The DRV invaded and occupied portions of Laos to assist them and their new National Liberation Front in South Vietnam. The war gradually escalated into the Second Indo-Chinese War, and we will discuss that, the war against the United States, in the next lecture.